Can you imagine being trapped in your own body, unable to speak or move, forced to watch helplessly as your beloved husband is systematically destroyed by the very children you bore and raised? Have you ever felt utterly powerless, your life's devotion and unconditional love weaponized against you? I'm Sarah Thorne, a retired registered nurse who built a life of genuine love and harmony with my second husband, John, after years of mediating tirelessly between him and my children from my first marriage. For 8 years, I poured my soul into our shared home, defending John against their occasional outbursts and resentments, believing with every fiber of my being that our blended family would ultimately thrive through patience and understanding. Then came the stroke that changed everything. Lying incapacitated in my hospital bed, unable to speak or move, but fully aware of every cruel word, my children, Michael and Lisa, descended like vultures circling wounded prey. They coerced my signature on false affidavits, fabricating lies about abuse that never happened, manipulating my paralyzed condition to obtain a restraining order against John. My beloved husband barred from my bedside during my greatest time of need. My heart became a shattered echo, trapped within my paralyzed body. As they celebrated their cruel victory, systematically stripping John of his home and access to me, while I lay helpless to protest a desperate flame of hope ignited in my consciousness. They didn't know about John's discreet home surveillance system, the digital recordings that had captured their monstrous plotting and manipulation. I was trapped in silence but not powerless. My enforced quiet would become my loudest scream for justice, and John's hidden truth would become our salvation. 3 weeks after the massive stroke that had stolen my voice and mobility, but left my mind cruelly intact, I lay in my narrow hospital bed, feeling like a ghost trapped within my own flesh. The rehabilitation ward had become my prison, where I could hear every word spoken around me, but could not respond, could not defend myself or the man I loved more than life itself. Michael and Lisa arrived each morning with the punctuality of executioners, filling my sterile room with intimidating stacks of legal documents that they would spread across my bedside table like weapons of war. Their faces wore expressions of false concern that barely concealed the calculated cruelty beneath their surface sympathy. "Mom," Michael would whisper with forced intensity, leaning close to my ear so the nurses couldn't overhear his manipulation. "You just need to sign these important papers. We know John has been stealing from you, hasn't he? Taking advantage of your trusting nature. You need to tell the authorities that he's been abusing you emotionally and financially, so we can finally get him out of your life and protect you properly." Lisa would position herself on the other side of my bed, her voice dripping with venomous sweetness that made my skin crawl with revulsion. "Don't you want to be safe and secure, Mom? Don't you want that manipulative man gone from our family forever? Just nod your head if you agree with what we're saying, and we'll take care of everything for you. We'll handle all the legal complications." Their immediate focus was transparently obvious to anyone with functioning brain cells. They wanted control of the house that John and I had lovingly restored together. They wanted him completely removed from the picture, and they wanted access to what they perceived as their rightful inheritance, that John was somehow preventing them from claiming. I tried desperately to shake my head to scream, "No!" with every ounce of strength remaining in my damaged body, but my paralyzed muscles betrayed me at every turn. My voice box felt like it was filled with concrete, and my limbs might as well have been made of lead for all the control I had over them. A part of me, perhaps foolishly clinging to hope, in the face of mounting evidence, still believed that if I could just recover enough to speak, I could explain the truth to them. I could make them understand that John had never hurt me, never stolen anything, never done anything but love me with a devotion I had never experienced in my first marriage. But their campaign of humiliation extended far beyond our private moments in the hospital room. They would speak loudly to the nursing staff, their voices carrying clearly down the hallway as they painted a picture of a vulnerable elderly woman whose mind was failing along with her body. "Poor Mom is really going downhill fast," Michael would announce to anyone within hearing distance, his voice heavy with manufactured sorrow. It's heartbreaking to watch her lose her mental faculties along with her physical abilities. These accidents and episodes of confusion are becoming more frequent, and we're genuinely worried about her safety. Lisa would chime in with her own contribution to their coordinated character assassination. "We honestly don't know how much longer we can manage her care at home. The house isn't even safe for someone in her condition anymore, what with all the stairs and the way John has been neglecting basic safety modifications that an elderly stroke victim would require." Even more devastating was the arrival of Mrs. Peterson, a manipulative family friend and distant relative who had harbored an inexplicable grudge against John since the day I had introduced him to our extended family. She would visit during peak visiting hours when the corridors were full of other families, speaking in stage whispers that were clearly designed to be overheard by maximum numbers of people. Mrs. Peterson would corroborate Michael and Lisa's fabricated stories to sympathetic neighbors, hospital staff, and anyone else who would listen further, isolating me from potential allies and systematically destroying John's reputation throughout our small community. Her poison was particularly effective because she had known our family for decades and people trusted her assessment of our situation. The legal pressure intensified when Michael and Lisa returned with a shady, aggressive attorney named Mr. Davies, a man they claimed had been highly recommended by Michael's business associates. Davies had the predatory look of someone who specialized in exploiting vulnerable elderly clients, and he immediately began initiating formal legal proceedings against John. "We need these affidavits signed immediately." Mrs. Thorne Davies would drone in his oily, intimidating voice, confirming John's pattern of financial mismanagement and emotional manipulation of your vulnerable state. "These documents will legally establish his unfitness to make decisions about your care or your property. It's the only way to protect you and your assets from his continued exploitation." He would lean over my bed with papers requiring my signature, speaking slowly and loudly as if I were mentally impaired rather than physically paralyzed. "Just nod your head if you understand what I'm explaining to you, and we'll guide your hand to sign in the appropriate places." My inability to speak or move had become their weapon of choice, allowing them to interpret my silence as consent for whatever legal manipulations they wanted to pursue. Every day brought new papers, new accusations, new legal maneuvers designed to strip John of his rights and remove him from my life permanently. The most heartbreaking aspect of their campaign was how they twisted my obvious distress into evidence supporting their false narrative. When tears would leak from my eyes in response to their cruel manipulations, they would comfort me with false sympathy while telling the medical staff that my emotional outbursts were further proof of the trauma John had supposedly inflicted upon me. I lay there day after day, trapped in my unresponsive body, watching helplessly as the children I had raised with love and sacrifice systematically destroyed the man who had brought me more happiness than I had ever thought possible in my golden years. The visits from Michael Lisa and their legal accomplice became a relentless torture that dominated my waking hours and haunted my fitful sleep. They would arrive with ever more complex legal documents, each one designed to further incriminate John and strengthen their case for having him declared unfit to make decisions about my care or our shared assets. They began discussing the inevitable sale of the property, with the casual efficiency of people dividing up an estate, even though I knew with absolute certainty that John was one of the most financially meticulous people I had ever encountered. He had spent his entire career as an accountant, and our household finances were organized with military precision that would have impressed my most demanding nursing supervisors. We've been looking at the books, Mom, Michael would say, while rifling through folders of fabricated evidence, and it's clear that John has been systematically draining your accounts to cover his own debts and gambling habits. We have documentation of irregular withdrawals and suspicious transactions that clearly show a pattern of financial elder abuse. Lisa would nod gravely beside him, adding her own fabricated details to their growing web of lies. The house payments have been falling behind Mom, and there are liens and legal judgments against John that you probably didn't even know about. We're going to have to sell the property quickly to cover all the debts he's accumulated in your name. They would twist my perceived answers to their leading questions, interpreting every twitch or facial expression as confirmation of their false allegations. When I would struggle to shake my head or show any sign of disagreement, they would pat my hand condescendingly and tell me not to worry about complicated financial matters that were too stressful for someone in my condition. The agonizing truth slowly crystallized in my consciousness like poison spreading through my veins. This was not protection or concern for my welfare. This was a calculated, methodical plot to destroy John, seize our home, and erase him from our lives while positioning themselves as my heroic rescuers, rather than the predators they had revealed themselves to be. My children were not merely misguided or acting out of misplaced concern for my safety. They were profoundly, monstrously ungrateful for everything I had sacrificed for their benefit, and they were actively malicious in their determination to punish John for the crime of making me happy after their father's death. The memories came flooding back with devastating clarity as I lay there, helpless to defend the man I loved. I remembered John's early years with our family, when my children were still grieving their father and openly hostile toward any man who tried to fill that irreplaceable role in their lives. I had spent countless hours mediating between them, pouring years of my personal time and emotional energy into ensuring their well-being while trying to help them understand John's genuine devotion to all of us. I had defended John against their occasional outbursts and deliberate provocations, always believing with naive optimism that time and patience would eventually help them recognize his unwavering commitment to our family's happiness. I had sacrificed my own peace of mind, and sometimes my relationship with John himself, to accommodate their needs and feelings, always putting their emotional comfort above my own desires for a harmonious household. I had bent over backward to include them in every decision, every holiday celebration, every family milestone, determined to prove that John's presence in our lives was an addition rather than a replacement. My devotion to John and my determination to make our blended family work had made me a target for their resentment and greed, while my children had learned to exploit my maternal instincts and use my love for them as a weapon against the man who had brought joy back into my life. After years of widowhood, when I would try to signal my distress through the only means available to me, a single tear escaping from my eye to roll down my cheek, Michael would gently wipe it away with false tenderness, while whispering poisonous reassurances. "Don't worry, Mom," he would say with practiced sympathy. "Soon John will be completely gone from your life, and you'll finally be safe from his manipulation and abuse. We're going to make sure he can never hurt you again." Lisa would lean in from the other side of my bed, her voice carrying a venomous satisfaction that revealed the true depth of her hatred for my husband. "He replaced Dad in your heart, Mom, and he never deserved that honor. This is exactly what he deserves for trying to steal our father's place in this family. They twisted my profound loyalty and sacrifice for John into evidence of weakness and vulnerability that justified their vengeful campaign against him. In their twisted logic, my love for John was proof that I had been manipulated and brainwashed, rather than evidence that I had found genuine happiness in my second marriage. The most chilling moment came when they outlined their ultimate solution for John's future with the cold efficiency of people discussing the disposal of unwanted household items. "He'll be placed in a state-run facility for indigent seniors," Lisa would state with obvious satisfaction, "somewhere far away from you where he belongs. He'll be among his own kind, other manipulative men who prey on vulnerable widows for their money and property." Michael would nod approvingly at his sister's cruel vision. "And the house will need to be liquidated immediately to cover your ongoing care expenses and to settle all the debts he's accumulated. It's actually quite clean from a legal standpoint, Mom. You don't need to worry your pretty head about any of the complicated details." Their intent was crystalline. In its calculated cruelty, systematically destroy John's life and reputation, strip him of his home and dignity, then eventually dispose of me as well, once they had secured control of whatever assets remained from our marriage. I was not their beloved mother, whose happiness and security they wanted to protect. I was simply a means to an end, a legal obstacle, standing between them and what they considered their rightful inheritance from a man they had never accepted as part of our family. The day that would forever divide my life into before and after arrived on a gray Tuesday morning when Michael and Lisa entered my hospital room, accompanied by their predatory attorney, Mr. Davies, and carrying a folder of official court documents that would seal John's fate. "It's done, Mom," Michael announced with barely concealed triumph, his eyes glowing with the satisfaction of someone who had just achieved a long-sought victory over a hated enemy. "The restraining order has been officially issued and served. John is now legally barred from the house and from having any contact with you whatsoever. It's all for your safety and protection, of course." Lisa moved to stand beside my bed, her face radiating the cruel pleasure of someone savoring a moment of complete power over those who had once held authority over her life. The court was very sympathetic when they heard about his pattern of financial and emotional abuse. The judge agreed that John poses a clear and present danger to your physical and mental well-being. Mr. Davies stepped forward with the satisfied air of a predator who had successfully cornered his prey, spreading the legal documents across my bedside table like trophies of war. "Mrs. Thorne, these court orders are comprehensive and binding. John Thorne is prohibited from entering the marital residence, contacting you directly or indirectly, or making any decisions regarding your medical care or financial affairs." My heart screamed with anguish that my paralyzed voice could never express. My beloved John, the man who had shown me what true love could be in the twilight of my life, was now legally separated from me during my greatest time of need and vulnerability. The crushing weight of guilt for being unable to protect him from this coordinated assault threatened to suffocate whatever remained of my fighting spirit. I tried with every ounce of strength in my damaged body to lift my hand, to point accusingly at their lies, to somehow communicate the truth about their monstrous deception. But my treacherous body remained as unresponsive as ever, trapping me in silence while they celebrated their victory over the man I loved. The immense surge of guilt for failing to protect John, coupled with the devastating realization of my children's complete moral bankruptcy, consumed me like acid eating through my soul. I was trapped in this useless shell of a body, forced to witness the systematic destruction of my beloved husband by the very children I had carried in my womb and raised with unconditional love. Lisa leaned close to my ear, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper that only I could hear while the others pretended to review the legal paperwork. "You're finally rid of him, Mom. Aren't you happy he never belonged in our family anyway? Dad would be rolling over in his grave, knowing what you let that stranger do to his memory." Michael simply nodded his agreement, his eyes cold and utterly devoid of any humanity or recognition that the woman lying helpless before him had once sacrificed everything for his welfare and happiness. The son I had raised to be compassionate and just had become a monster whose capacity for cruelty exceeded anything I could have imagined. Mr. Davies handed them official copies of the restraining order with a thin smile that revealed his satisfaction at successfully completing another profitable case of legal manipulation. They were actually celebrating John's banishment from my life, utterly indifferent to the anguish that was tearing my heart apart, piece by piece. As they turned to leave my room, probably to celebrate their victory with an expensive lunch charged to my credit card, a wave of desperate determination surged through my consciousness like electricity through damaged wiring. Despite my physical limitations, my mind was still sharp, still capable of strategic thinking that my years as a head nurse had taught me. My eyes still capable of deliberate movement, despite my overall paralysis, darted frantically toward the small frame photograph of John and me that sat on my bedside table. The picture had been taken during our honeymoon in Ireland, both of us laughing with pure joy as we stood before an ancient castle that had survived centuries of warfare and political upheaval. They had missed this precious memento in their haste to remove all traces of John from my immediate environment, and now it became my lifeline to hope and resistance. I managed to produce an almost imperceptible twitch of my left index finger, a subtle, deliberate movement that would mean nothing to casual observers, but represented a prearranged signal that only John would recognize. Years ago, during the early playful days of our marriage, we had developed a secret system of tiny gestures and signals that we could use to communicate private thoughts during social gatherings or family events. John had suggested it as a romantic game, but now it might become our salvation. I recalled with perfect clarity his casual remarks over the years about home security and smart devices that could monitor our property and protect us from intruders or emergencies. I had never realized the full extent of his methodical preparations, but now fragments of conversations came flooding back with new significance. "Truth always leaves a trace, Sarah," he had told me once during a discussion about a news story involving elder abuse. "The key is knowing where to look for the evidence and having the patience to document everything carefully." I knew John's accountant background had made him naturally paranoid about fraud and deception. He had installed what he called a comprehensive security system throughout our home, including cameras and recording devices that he claimed were necessary to protect our valuable belongings and monitor for break-ins or medical emergencies. What Michael and Lisa didn't know, what they could never have suspected, was that John's security system included hidden cameras and microphones in every room of our house, all connected to an encrypted laptop and cloud server that automatically backed up everything to multiple secure locations. The system had captured every conversation, every moment of their plotting and scheming, every instance of their manipulation and lies. It had recorded John's gentle, loving care of me during my recovery from minor illnesses, their venomous discussions about getting rid of him, and even their recent visits to this very hospital room. John had actually worn a tiny disguised recording device during their confrontational visits, anticipating exactly this kind of malicious behavior based on years of observing their resentment and hostility toward our marriage. His methodical, careful nature had prepared for the possibility that they might eventually try to turn me against him or use legal manipulation to destroy our relationship. The irrefutable evidence existed stored safely in digital formats that would prove their conspiracy and vindicate John's character beyond any reasonable doubt. All John needed was access to the system and someone who would listen to the truth instead of their carefully constructed lies. As I lay there, watching my children and their accomplice leave my room in triumph, I focused all my remaining strength on that tiny finger movement, repeating the signal again and again in the hope that John would somehow find a way to see it and understand what I was trying to communicate. I was trapped in silence, but I was not defeated. My children had won this battle, but the war for truth and justice was far from over. John would know what to do when he discovered the evidence that would expose their monstrous deception and restore his rightful place by my side. The next day brought what felt like a miracle wrapped in the most ordinary of circumstances. A sympathetic nurse named Caroline, who had worked with stroke patients for over 20 years, approached my bedside during the quiet evening shift when the hospital corridors were mostly empty of visitors and administrative staff. "Mrs. Thorne," she whispered gently, her voice carrying the compassion that had drawn me to nursing decades earlier. "I've been watching your situation with growing concern. I know what real family devotion looks like, and what I've witnessed from your children doesn't match that pattern." She glanced toward the doorway to ensure we wouldn't be overheard before continuing. "I've arranged for your husband to have a brief supervised visit with you tonight. Officially, it's for you to sign some important medical documents that require both spouses' consent. The restraining order has a medical emergency exception that I'm invoking on your behalf." When John appeared in my doorway 20 minutes later, looking haggard and heartbroken, but still carrying himself with the dignity I had always admired, my heart soared with relief and desperate hope. His eyes immediately found mine, and I could see the torment he had been carrying since being forced away from my bedside. Caroline positioned herself discreetly near the door, watching for any hospital administrators who might question John's presence, while I summoned every ounce of strength to reproduce that subtle finger signal we had developed during our playful early years together. John's eyes, though filled with exhaustion and emotional pain, suddenly flashed with recognition and understanding as he caught my deliberate movement. I watched his expression transform from despair to focused determination as he realized I was trying to communicate something crucial about our situation. My silent declaration rang through my consciousness with crystal clarity. "Find the truth, John. Expose them for what they really are. The evidence exists. You know where to look." John leaned closer, pretending to adjust my blanket, while whispering so quietly that only I could hear his words. "I understand, Sarah. I know what you're telling me. I'll find what we need to prove their lies and bring you home where you belong. After John left the hospital, his mind was reeling but laser-focused on the task ahead of him. Meanwhile, Michael and Lisa remained completely oblivious to the silent communication that had just taken place under their noses. They were too busy celebrating what they believed was their absolute victory over the man they had always resented. "He's finally gone," Lisa crowed to Michael as they sat in the hospital cafeteria planning their next steps in liquidating our shared assets. "Did you see the look on his face when security escorted him out yesterday? He knows he's beaten and has no legal recourse left." Michael nodded with obvious satisfaction, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast to their successful manipulation. "Mom will be so much better off without his toxic influence in her life. When she recovers her speech, she'll thank us for protecting her from that predator." They were so confident in their fabricated narrative and legal maneuvering that they never considered the possibility that their carefully constructed lies might be vulnerable to exposure through evidence they hadn't anticipated. Acting on my unspoken plea and his own methodical nature, John went directly from the hospital to our bank, where he accessed the safe deposit box that contained the encrypted laptop he had installed as the central hub of our home security system. His hands shook slightly as he powered up the device and logged into the cloud server that had been automatically recording and backing up footage from our house for the past 3 years. The digital files began loading with devastating clarity. Months of surveillance footage revealed the true story of our family dynamics. John's gentle patient care during my minor health episodes, his meticulous attention to household maintenance and financial management, and most damning of all, crystal clear recordings of Michael and Lisa's private conversations about their plan to remove him from our lives. The system had captured their discussions about manipulating my medical condition to gain legal control, their coordination with Mr. Davies to fabricate abuse allegations, and even chilling audio from their recent visits to my hospital room where they had coerced my apparent consent through my physical helplessness. John was simultaneously horrified by the scope of their calculated cruelty and energized by the irrefutable evidence that would vindicate both of us. My silent hope had found its voice through technology and his foresight in preparing for exactly this kind of betrayal. When Michael and Lisa received legal notification about John's new counsel and an impending lawsuit challenging the restraining order and abuse allegations, their initial reaction was dismissive contempt rather than concern about potential consequences. "He's obviously bluffing," Lisa sneered as she read the formal legal documents that had been served at her home. "What proof could he possibly have? It's just his word against ours, and we have medical professionals and legal authorities who have already accepted our version of events." Michael was equally confident in their position, waving the legal papers dismissively as if they were nothing more than desperate harassment from a defeated opponent. Who would believe a bitter old man who's been caught abusing an elderly stroke victim? Our documentation is solid. Our witnesses are credible, and Mom can't contradict our story even if she wanted to. Mr. Davies, when contacted about John's legal challenge, assured them that their case was airtight and that John's lawsuit was nothing more than the last gasps of someone who had already lost everything and was simply trying to cause trouble out of spite. They remained defiantly confident that their fabricated story of John's abuse was legally and socially unassailable, never imagining that every moment of their conspiracy had been meticulously documented by the very security system John had installed to protect our home and our safety. Their arrogance and certainty in their victory would soon become their greatest vulnerability as the truth they had tried so hard to bury was about to emerge with devastating clarity. Armed with irrefutable video and audio evidence of Michael and Lisa's conspiracy, John moved swiftly to secure the best legal representation available for our situation. He contacted Margaret Sullivan, a highly respected elder law attorney who specialized in cases involving family exploitation and had built her reputation on protecting vulnerable seniors from predatory relatives. Margaret reviewed the surveillance footage with the experienced eye of someone who had seen every form of elder abuse imaginable, but even she was shocked by the calculated nature of Michael and Lisa's campaign against us. "Mr. Thorne," she said, after spending hours examining the digital evidence, "this is one of the most comprehensive and damning cases of coordinated elder abuse I've encountered in 30 years of practice. Your wife's children have essentially created a textbook example of how predatory family members manipulate medical emergencies to steal assets and destroy relationships." Within days, Margaret had initiated immediate legal action, presenting the surveillance footage to both the family court that had issued the restraining order and to Adult Protective Services, whose investigators were stunned by the scope of the deception they had unknowingly facilitated. John wasn't just fighting for his own vindication. He was fighting for me, for our marriage, for the truth that had been buried under layers of legal manipulation and false medical assessments. Every action he took was motivated by his determination to restore our life together and protect me from further harm. His strategy extended beyond merely defending against their false allegations. Working with a skilled neurologist, Dr. Patricia Chen John arranged for comprehensive cognitive testing that would definitively prove my mental faculties remained sharp despite my physical limitations. The tests revealed what John had always known. My mind was completely intact, and I was fully capable of making my own decisions about my care and my relationships. John also secured the services of excellent speech and physical therapists who could help me regain the abilities that the stroke had temporarily stolen. Our shared goal became not just legal vindication, but my complete recovery and our return to the peaceful life we had built together, far from the poisonous influence of my children's greed and resentment. The confrontation we had all been anticipating came several weeks later during a pretrial hearing designed to review the evidence and determine whether the restraining order should remain in effect. The courthouse was packed with family members, legal professionals, and social workers who had become involved in our case. Michael and Lisa arrived at the courthouse, accompanied by Mr. Davies, all three of them exuding their usual arrogance and confidence in their fabricated narrative. They moved through the courthouse corridors like people who had already won their case and were simply going through the formalities of legal procedure. When they spotted John and me in the hallway outside the courtroom, I was there in a wheelchair, attended by the dedicated therapists who had been helping with my recovery. Their expression shifted to a mixture of surprise and disdain that they made no effort to conceal. Lisa approached us with that familiar smirk that had become her signature expression whenever she felt she held power over someone she considered beneath her. Well, if it isn't the victim and her abuser trying to stir up more trouble," she said loudly enough for other people in the hallway to hear. "Still clinging to your delusions. Mom and John, are you still trying to blame innocent family members for your own failures and criminal behavior?" Michael joined his sister with a dismissive wave that was clearly intended to demonstrate his contempt for both of us. "You'll never win this case, John," he declared with absolute confidence. "Everyone who matters already knows that Mom's mental condition is declining rapidly. Your desperate attempts to challenge the legal system will only make you look more guilty and unstable. Mr. Davies whispered reassurances to both of them, clearly confident that their fabricated evidence and witness testimony would withstand any challenge that John's legal team might present. They had no idea that their entire conspiracy was about to be exposed in the most public and humiliating way possible. When we entered the courtroom and the hearing began, John maintained the calm, methodical demeanor that had served him well throughout his accounting career. With Margaret's guidance, he simply placed a small, discreet tablet on the evidence table for the judge and opposing counsel to examine. "Your Honor," John said with quiet authority, "we have comprehensive evidence that will expose the true nature of Mrs. Thorne's supposed decline and my alleged abuse. The evidence is irrefutable, time-stamped, and legally verifiable." He activated the tablet to display a carefully selected clip from our home surveillance system, showing a time-stamped recording of Michael and Lisa in our living room, explicitly discussing their strategy for manipulating my medical condition to gain legal control over our assets. The blood drained from Michael and Lisa's faces as they watched themselves on screen, their own voices clearly audible as they plotted my husband's destruction with the casual cruelty of people discussing weekend plans. The judge's expression shifted from professional neutrality to barely concealed outrage as the full implications of what she was witnessing became clear. Judge Patricia Hawkins, a veteran of family court who had seen every form of domestic manipulation imaginable, immediately ordered the full disclosure and review of all surveillance footage that John's legal team had collected. What followed were several days of testimony and video evidence that systematically dismantled every aspect of Michael and Lisa's false narrative. John, working closely with Margaret Sullivan, presented the months of recordings with the methodical precision of someone building an airtight case against criminal defendants. Each video clip was introduced with careful context, creating a comprehensive timeline that revealed the calculated nature of their conspiracy against us. The footage showed John's gentle, loving care during my recovery from minor illnesses, his meticulous attention to household finances and medical appointments, and his genuine concern for my welfare in every interaction. More damaging to Michael and Lisa's credibility were the recordings of their private conversations where they discussed their resentment of our marriage, their plans to exploit my medical emergency, and their coordination with Mr. Davies to fabricate legal evidence. Perhaps most devastating were the audio recordings from my hospital room, where their voices could be clearly heard, coercing my apparent consent through leading questions and deliberate misinterpretation of my involuntary responses. The judge's growing anger was evident as each piece of evidence further exposed the scope of their deception and the vulnerable position they had deliberately exploited for their own financial gain. Humiliated and cornered by the mounting evidence against them, Lisa made the catastrophic decision to launch a desperate public relations campaign designed to discredit the surveillance footage and paint John as a dangerous stalker who had fabricated evidence to escape justice. She organized an impromptu press conference outside the courthouse where she tearfully accused John of illegal surveillance, stalking behavior, and doctoring video evidence to support his lies about our family. "This is nothing more than a desperate old man's revenge fantasy," she declared to the assembled reporters and camera crews, her voice rising to an almost hysterical pitch. "He's trying to steal our mother's inheritance by destroying the children who were trying to protect her from his abuse and manipulation. Michael stood beside her looking utterly terrified, apparently recognizing that their situation was spiraling beyond their control, but lacking the courage to distance himself from his sister's increasingly desperate tactics. John Thorne has violated our privacy, our safety, and our mother's dignity with his obsessive need to monitor and control every aspect of our family's interactions. Lisa continued her accusations, becoming more wild and unfounded with each statement. John's response at the next court session was a masterpiece of calm, factual refutation that highlighted the absurdity of their latest accusations while providing additional evidence of their dishonesty and desperation. "Your Honor," John stated with unshakable composure, "the surveillance system in question was installed over 3 years ago for general home security purposes, as the original installation permits and Mr. Davies' own office records will confirm. The system was designed to protect our home from break-ins and to monitor for medical emergencies, not to spy on family members." He then activated the courtroom's video system to display a clip from Lisa's press conference, followed immediately by surveillance footage from our home that showed her and Michael explicitly discussing their strategy to plant seeds of doubt about my mental condition with neighbors, hospital staff, and anyone else who would listen to their fabricated concerns. The contrast between Lisa's public protestations of innocence and her recorded admissions of calculated manipulation was so stark that several people in the courtroom audibly gasped at the blatant dishonesty they were witnessing. The footage is completely unedited, properly authenticated, and legally obtained from our own private property. John continued his voice, carrying the authority of someone presenting indisputable facts. "Mrs. Thorne and I have nothing to hide, which is why we welcome the most thorough possible examination of all evidence in this case." Judge Hawkins, now visibly angered by the scope of deception that had been perpetrated in her courtroom, immediately cited Michael and Lisa for contempt of court and ordered a comprehensive police investigation into their activities for elder abuse fraud and conspiracy to commit perjury. Mr. Davies, finally recognizing that his professional reputation and legal license were in serious jeopardy, hastily filed motions to withdraw from the case and distance himself from his former clients. His frantic attempts to avoid professional consequences only served to further highlight the questionable nature of his involvement in their scheme. Mrs. Peterson, the manipulative family friend who had corroborated their false stories throughout the community, found herself publicly disgraced and ostracized by neighbors who finally understood how she had been used as a weapon in their campaign against John and me. The district attorney, who had been monitoring the case due to its potential criminal implications, announced that formal charges for elder abuse fraud, conspiracy, and perjury were being prepared against Michael and Lisa, with the surveillance footage serving as the primary evidence for prosecution. The complete reversal of their legal and social position was swift and devastating, transforming them from sympathetic children, protecting their vulnerable mother, into exposed criminals facing serious jail time for their calculated cruelty. 3 weeks after the criminal investigation had been officially launched and their names had become synonymous with elder abuse throughout our community, John received a phone call that would mark the final chapter in our relationship with my children. Michael's voice, when John answered, was a mixture of rage, fear, and desperate disbelief at how completely their lives had unraveled. "John, what have you done to us?" Michael screamed into the phone, his voice cracking with emotion and barely controlled panic. Our entire lives are destroyed. Lisa is having some kind of nervous breakdown. Our friends won't return our calls. Our neighbors cross the street to avoid us. His words came out in a torrent of accusation and self-pity, revealing his complete inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of his own actions. The police are treating us like criminals. They've frozen our bank accounts. Lisa lost her job because of the publicity. You're systematically ruining everything we've worked to build. You have to drop these charges and make this nightmare stop. John held the phone away from his ear so I could hear Michael's desperate tirade from my hospital bed, where I was continuing my recovery with the help of the excellent medical team John had assembled. Despite my limited ability to speak, I managed to offer John a faint, sad smile and a barely perceptible nod, communicating my support for whatever decision he felt was appropriate. "Michael," John replied with the steady calm that had sustained him throughout this ordeal, "your current problems are the direct and inevitable consequence of your own deliberate choices. You chose to destroy Sarah and me through lies, manipulation, and legal fraud. My actions in seeking truth and justice are simply the natural repercussions of your calculated cruelty and depravity." John's voice carried the authority of someone who had been vindicated by irrefutable evidence and no longer felt any need to justify his actions to people who had forfeited any claim to his consideration or mercy. "You made your bed through systematic elder abuse and conspiracy against your own mother. Now you must lie in it and face the legal and social consequences like adults." Michael's anger quickly dissolved into pathetic, tearful begging that revealed the depth of his desperation and the complete collapse of his former arrogance and confidence. "Please, John, you have to understand what you're doing to us. We're going to lose our house. Our reputation in this community is completely destroyed. Lisa can't find work anywhere because everyone knows about the charges." His voice took on the whining tone of a child trying to escape punishment through emotional manipulation, rather than accepting responsibility for his behavior. "We were just misguided in our approach to protecting Mom. We made some mistakes in judgment, but we never meant for things to go this far. Can't we sit down and talk about this like reasonable adults? Can't we find some way to work out our differences for Mom's sake?" The transparent desperation in his voice was nauseating, representing a complete reversal from the confident manipulator who had orchestrated my husband's legal persecution just weeks earlier. "We're still family, John. We're all that Mom has left in this world. For old time's sake, can't you find it in your heart to show us some mercy and compassion?" John looked at me with an expression of profound sorrow mixed with unwavering resolve. Despite everything Michael and Lisa had done to us, he felt genuine sadness for the waste and destruction they had brought upon themselves through their own choices. "There is absolutely nothing left to reconcile, Michael," John stated with quiet finality. "You chose calculated cruelty over family loyalty. You chose greed over love. You chose lies over truth. Sarah and I have chosen justice, peace, and the protection of our marriage from further attacks." His voice carried the weight of absolute decision, making it clear that no amount of pleading or manipulation would change his mind about the consequences they would face. "You will face the full legal and social consequences of your actions. The criminal justice system will determine your punishment, and the community will judge your character based on the evidence you provided through your own recorded words and behavior." With those final words, John calmly pressed the end call button, cutting off Michael's continued protests and desperate appeals for mercy. He then methodically blocked Michael's number, Lisa's number, and instructed our attorney to handle any further contact attempts through official legal channels only. The silence that followed was profound and utterly liberating for both of us. For the first time since my stroke, I felt completely free from the poisonous influence of children who had revealed themselves to be strangers, wearing familiar faces, people whose capacity for cruelty exceeded anything I could have imagined when I held them as babies and dreamed of the adults they might become. John and I had chosen truth over manipulation, justice over false peace, and our love for each other over the obligation to enable people who had forfeited any claim to our consideration through their own monstrous behavior. The war was over, and we had emerged victorious, scarred but stronger, ready to rebuild our life together without the burden of people who had proven themselves unworthy of our love and trust. 8 months had passed since the criminal trials that had resulted in Michael and Lisa's convictions for elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. My recovery had progressed remarkably well under John's devoted care and the excellent medical team he had assembled, and I was finally strong enough to participate in community events that had meaning for both of us. The Elder Protection Foundation had invited John to speak at their annual fundraiser about our harrowing experience and the importance of recognizing the warning signs of family-perpetrated abuse. The event was being held at the Riverside Community Center with over 200 attendees, including social workers, healthcare professionals, legal advocates, and concerned community members. As John stood at the podium, delivering his powerful, moving speech about our ordeal and the systematic way my children had exploited my medical vulnerability for their own gain, I noticed 2 familiar figures seated in the back section of the auditorium near the exit doors. Michael and Lisa were there, looking gaunt and disheveled, their once confident demeanor replaced by the haunted appearance of people who had been thoroughly destroyed by the consequences of their own actions. They appeared to be attending not as supporters of elder protection, but as broken individuals whose presence felt more like an act of desperate voyeurism than genuine interest in the cause. The contrast between their current appearance and the polished, manipulative people who had once orchestrated my husband's legal persecution was both shocking and deeply satisfying. They looked exactly like what they had always been beneath their surface respectability: hollow, damaged people whose cruelty had ultimately consumed them. John was describing the psychological impact of being separated from me during my greatest time of need, when Lisa suddenly stumbled forward from her seat, her movement unsteady, and her voice rising to a shrill pitch that cut through the respectful silence of the auditorium. "Don't listen to them," she screamed, her words slurred slightly, as if she had been drinking before attending the event. "It's all lies. They're fabricating everything for money and attention. He's a monster who manipulated our sick mother. She's senile and doesn't know what she's saying." Her baseless accusations poured out in a torrent of desperation and bitterness, clearly the product of months of incarceration and social ostracism that had driven her to the edge of a complete mental breakdown. She was obviously in severe psychological distress, but her attack on us was still calculated to cause maximum damage to our credibility before this sympathetic audience. They destroyed our family with lies and fake evidence. They turned everyone against us. My mother doesn't understand what really happened to her. She's being controlled and manipulated by that monster she married. Michael stood silently beside his sister, like a defeated shadow, apparently lacking the energy or conviction to either support her desperate outburst or distance himself from her increasingly unhinged behavior. The confident man who had once orchestrated my legal persecution had been reduced to a broken shell, who seemed to have lost all sense of purpose or direction. A ripple of shock and uncomfortable confusion swept through the distinguished audience. These were professionals who had devoted their careers to protecting vulnerable elderly citizens, but Lisa's passionate, seemingly heartfelt accusations, delivered with such raw emotion, created a moment of uncertainty that was both predictable and deeply painful. Some attendees exchanged uneasy glances, their eyes moving between Lisa and us with expressions of doubt and concern. The weight of these baseless but emotionally charged accusations delivered during such a vulnerable moment in our public testimony felt like that familiar, painful stab of humiliation that had once made me question my own sanity and worth. My heart began pounding with a mixture of embarrassment and righteous anger, but instead of the crushing shame that had once paralyzed me, I felt something much more powerful rising within me. The unshakable confidence that comes from possessing documented truth and the unwavering support of people who had witnessed our journey from victims to survivors. Despite the escalating public humiliation and the uncomfortable murmurs rippling through the audience, John maintained an incredible level of poise and dignity that seemed to shine brighter in contrast to Lisa's desperate breakdown. With a quick glance at me that conveyed both reassurance and determination, he allowed her to continue her performance without interruption. John's expression remained one of profound sadness rather than anger, conveying the heartbreak of someone who had watched people destroy themselves through their own choices rather than the fury of someone seeking revenge. He stood calmly at the podium, waiting patiently for Lisa to exhaust herself, knowing that her uncontrolled outburst was actually serving our larger purpose. The cameras that were recording the event for later broadcast continued capturing every moment of this extraordinary confrontation, documenting not only Lisa's hysterical accusations, but also our composed, dignified response to being publicly attacked by the very people whose criminal behavior had brought us to this podium. I could see John's strategic thinking at work as he allowed Lisa's desperation and malice to be fully exposed to everyone present. Her breakdown was providing undeniable proof of her character and mental instability, making our previous testimony about her calculated cruelty even more credible and compelling. The longer Lisa ranted, the more obvious it became to everyone watching that her accusations were the products of desperation and mental illness rather than legitimate concerns about our credibility or the accuracy of our testimony. As Lisa's voice finally began to fade, growing hoarse from the intensity and volume of her desperate tirade, John calmly stepped forward and gently reclaimed the microphone from the conference organizer who had been trying to restore order to the proceedings. The auditorium fell into an expectant silence. Hundreds of eyes focused on him with growing sympathy and curiosity as they waited to see how he would respond to such a vicious public attack. "Lisa," John began, his voice quiet, but somehow managing to resonate through every corner of the large auditorium, carrying a weight of dignity and sorrow that immediately commanded the attention and respect of everyone present. "You stand here speaking passionately about lies and fabrication, about manipulation and family destruction. Perhaps this is the perfect opportunity to show everyone present the documented truth about calculated cruelty and attempted murder." Behind him, the large projection screen that had been displaying photographs from our elder protection advocacy work suddenly changed to show official court documents that had been prepared specifically for such a moment. The first image was the formal legal judgment from the criminal court, clearly showing that Michael and Lisa had been convicted of elder abuse fraud conspiracy and attempted murder, with the surveillance footage serving as the primary evidence that had convinced the jury of their guilt. The legal language was technical and formal, but the findings of fact were unmistakable and damning. The court had not only found them guilty beyond reasonable doubt, but had specifically cited their pattern of sophisticated psychological manipulation designed to exploit the victim's medical vulnerability for financial gain. Next to the court documents, John projected what would become the most devastating piece of evidence in our entire case: a crystal clear image from our home surveillance system showing Lisa meticulously loosening the carpet runner at the top of our staircase, followed by footage of her subtly tampering with the mechanical components of my stair lift, all captured just hours before my accidental fall that had resulted in the stroke. This, John stated clearly, his gaze meeting Lisa's across the auditorium with unwavering directness, is the court's official verdict on your version of truth. These are not the confused fantasies of elderly victims suffering from dementia, but the documented findings of a criminal justice system that examined every piece of evidence with the most rigorous scrutiny possible. He gestured toward the chilling surveillance footage, allowing the audience to absorb the full implications of what they were witnessing. And this represents the calculated attempt on Sarah's life, orchestrated by her own children, who viewed her as nothing more than an obstacle standing between them and what they considered their rightful inheritance from our marriage. The auditorium was completely silent, now the earlier confusion and doubt replaced by growing horror and outrage as the audience began to understand the true scope of the systematic abuse we had endured. You sought to break Sarah's spirit through psychological warfare, to steal our home through legal manipulation, and ultimately to eliminate me from her life through deliberate sabotage that nearly killed the woman who gave you life. John's voice grew stronger and more authoritative as he continued, fueled by months of suppressed anger and the satisfaction of finally being able to expose the complete truth about their monstrous behavior. But what you fundamentally misunderstood, what your arrogance and greed blinded you to, is that integrity, unlike your heart's, cannot be shattered through cruelty and manipulation. Truth, unlike your fabricated accusations, becomes stronger when challenged by lies and desperation. He paused, allowing the full weight of his words to settle over the auditorium before delivering the final blow to Lisa's desperate attempt to discredit us. Our presence here today, our ability to stand before this distinguished audience as survivors and advocates rather than broken victims, represents not vengeance, but the ultimate victory of authentic human dignity over calculated depravity. John looked directly at Lisa, seeing fear and recognition in her eyes for the first time since this confrontation had begun. You, Lisa, and your brother Michael are the ones who represent emptiness, the hollow spaces where love, empathy, and basic human decency should have resided, not we. Event security officers who had been monitoring the situation since Lisa's initial outburst immediately moved to apprehend both siblings as they recognized that the disruption had escalated far beyond acceptable boundaries and that the evidence being presented suggested they were in the presence of convicted criminals. A collective gasp swept through the entire audience as the full implications of the surveillance footage became unmistakably clear. These were professionals who had devoted their careers to protecting elderly citizens from exactly the kind of sophisticated abuse that Michael and Lisa had perpetrated, and they could immediately recognize the premeditation and cruelty involved in their conspiracy against us. The whispered conversations that had begun with uncertainty and doubt now buzzed with outrage and condemnation directed squarely at Lisa and Michael. Their names were being spoken openly throughout the auditorium with expressions of disgust, professional disapproval, and genuine horror at the scope of their betrayal of fundamental family bonds. How could children do that to their own mother? Someone observed with obvious revulsion. That's absolutely monstrous behavior, came from another section of the audience. This is exactly why we need stronger criminal penalties for elder abuse, noted a voice with clear professional authority. Security officers reached Lisa and Michael's location, just as the crowd's disapproval reached a crescendo of boos and cries of monsters and shame from audience members who could no longer contain their outrage at witnessing the perpetrators of such systematic cruelty attempting to victimize their targets once again. The officers moved with professional efficiency and appropriate restraint, clearly recognizing that while Lisa and Michael needed to be removed from the premises immediately, they were ultimately more pathetic than dangerous. Broken people whose own actions had destroyed their lives more thoroughly than any external punishment could have achieved. Lisa's face had become a mask of utter defeat and public humiliation that was almost painful to witness. The manipulative woman who had once controlled every aspect of my daily existence had been reduced to a broken, desperate figure whose lies had been exposed before hundreds of professional witnesses and broadcast to viewers across the region. Her eyes filled with raw, impotent rage and what might have been the first stirrings of genuine understanding about the magnitude of what she had lost, met John's for one final devastating moment before she was escorted toward the exit. Michael followed behind the security officers in complete silence, his head bowed in absolute disgrace, his face pale with what appeared to be a combination of shame and terror at the complete collapse of whatever reputation or standing they had once possessed in their community. As the auditorium doors closed behind them, sealing their exit from not just this event, but from any possibility of functioning within honest professional or social circles, a spontaneous round of applause began building throughout the audience and quickly grew into a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The applause was not just for our presentation, but for our courage in surviving and exposing the kind of systematic family abuse that destroys so many elderly victims who lack the resources, documentation, or support systems necessary to fight back effectively against those who should love and protect them most. 4 months after the public conference that had definitively ended Michael and Lisa's ability to show their faces in any respectable social or professional setting, John and I had settled into a peaceful routine of recovery and advocacy work that felt like a second honeymoon after surviving the most difficult period of our marriage. My physical therapy was progressing remarkably well, and I had regained much of my speech and mobility, though I still relied on a wheelchair for longer distances and required John's assistance with some daily activities. Our home had been restored to the sanctuary of love and tranquility it had been before my stroke, and we were both finding deep satisfaction in our work with elder protection organizations. Then, on a quiet Tuesday morning, as John was helping me with breakfast on our sun-drenched patio, a heavily redacted letter arrived from the Women's Correctional Facility where Lisa was serving her sentence for elder abuse and attempted murder. The return address was barely legible, but the careful, desperate handwriting inside was unmistakably Michael's. His letter painted a picture of complete devastation that was both heartbreaking and somehow inevitable, given the choices he had made. He wrote about his profound regret Lisa's severe mental deterioration during her incarceration and his own utter ruin following their criminal convictions and the civil lawsuits that had stripped them of any remaining assets. But beneath the catalog of misfortune and self-pity, his letter contained what appeared to be desperate appeals for reconciliation that were motivated more by his current desperation than by any genuine understanding of the harm he had caused or authentic remorse for his systematic abuse. I know I have no right to ask anything of you after everything that's happened, he wrote, but I'm hoping that somewhere in your heart you might find it possible to forgive the terrible mistakes I made. I'm still your son, and despite all our problems, I still need you in my life. 3 weeks after the letter arrived, Michael somehow secured permission for a supervised visit at the rehabilitation center where I was continuing my physical therapy. When the facility's social worker called to inform us about his request, John and I decided that facing him one final time might provide the closure we needed to move forward completely. When Michael appeared in the center's visiting room, I barely recognized him as the confident, manipulative man who had orchestrated my husband's legal persecution just over a year earlier. He had lost considerable weight. His once expensive clothing had been replaced by ill-fitting garments provided by the correctional system, and his face bore the hollow, haunted expression of someone who had been systematically destroyed by the consequences of his own actions. The moment he saw me sitting in my wheelchair with John standing protectively beside me, Michael fell to his knees on the polished floor of the visiting room, tears streaming down his gaunt cheeks in a display of theatrical desperation that would have been manipulative if it hadn't been so genuinely pathetic. Mom, he choked out, his voice barely audible through his sobs. I was so incredibly wrong about everything. I've lost everything that ever mattered to me, and I'm completely alone in the world now. Lisa has had a complete mental breakdown in prison. She doesn't even recognize me when I visit her. His words came out in a desperate rush, as if he was afraid I might leave before he could say everything he had rehearsed during his months of incarceration. I'm so sorry for everything I did to you and John, for every cruel word, for every way I tried to destroy your marriage and steal your happiness. Please, I'm begging you to forgive me. I'm still your son. No matter how badly I've failed you, I need you more than I've ever needed anyone in my entire life. His performance was undeniably pathetic, inspiring a mixture of pity and revulsion, but it was also transparently calculated to exploit whatever maternal instincts I might still harbor toward the child he had once been. I'll do absolutely anything to make this right between us. He continued, his voice taking on that familiar manipulative tone I remembered from his childhood attempts to escape consequences through emotional blackmail. Just a little help to start over when I get out of prison, please, for old time's sake. Can't we find some way to be a family again? Don't you remember how close we used to be before John came into our lives? I looked down at this broken man kneeling on the visiting room floor, feeling nothing but the profound emptiness where my maternal love had once resided. The pain and anger that had once consumed me had long since receded, replaced by a crystalline clarity that allowed me to see this situation for exactly what it was. This was not genuine remorse or authentic accountability for the systematic psychological abuse and attempted murder he had committed. This was simply another attempt to use emotional manipulation to extract resources and support from someone he had already betrayed in the most fundamental way possible. I allowed him to continue his humiliating performance without interruption, letting him expose the full depth of his desperation and the shallow nature of his supposed transformation. My silence was not cruelty, but simply recognition that nothing he could say would restore what he had deliberately destroyed through his own monstrous choices. My eyes met John's, who stood beside my wheelchair like a silent pillar of strength and unwavering support. And I saw in his expression the same calm resolution that had sustained us both throughout this ordeal. When Michael finally looked up at me with desperate, expectant eyes, clearly hoping to see some sign that his emotional manipulation was beginning to work, I spoke with a voice that, though still slightly affected by my stroke, carried unmistakable authority and finality. "Michael," I said, my words carefully chosen for maximum clarity and impact. "The son I knew and loved, the family we once shared, died permanently the moment you chose to conspire against John to destroy our home and to attempt to take my life for your own financial gain." I paused, looking directly into his eyes with the steady gaze of someone who had found complete peace with their decisions. "The love I gave you was genuine and unconditional, offered freely from a mother's heart over decades of devotion and sacrifice. My presence in your life was meant to be a blessing, a source of wisdom and support as you built your own adult relationships and career." My voice remained calm and measured, but carried an authority that left no room for argument, negotiation, or further manipulation. "But your betrayal was absolute and calculating, revealing the true nature of your character in a way that can never be undone, forgotten, or forgiven. There is nothing left to reconcile because there is no relationship remaining to repair or rebuild." I turned my wheelchair toward the door, with John's gentle assistance, preparing to leave this final confrontation behind forever. "You made your choice when you decided that my death was preferable to allowing me to live happily with the man I loved. John and I have made our choice as well, to protect our hard-won peace and security from any further contact with someone who proved himself capable of attempted murder against his own mother." The soft sound of the visiting room door closing behind us was the final punctuation mark on a relationship that had been dead since the moment Michael first loosened that carpet runner on our staircase, even if he was only now beginning to understand the permanence of what he had destroyed through his own actions. As John wheeled me back to our car, I felt a profound sense of completion and closure that was more satisfying than any revenge could have been. We had not only survived their worst efforts to destroy us, but we had emerged stronger, more united, and more purposeful than ever before. My recovery progressed steadily over the following months, fueled by John's unwavering love and devotion, and the quiet comfort of our beautifully restored home that had once again become the sanctuary of peace and happiness we had originally created together. The house that Michael and Lisa had tried to steal from us now felt more precious than ever, every room filled with memories of our survival and triumph over systematic cruelty. I rediscovered simple joys that had been lost during the darkness of our ordeal, tending my beloved garden where John had planted new roses to celebrate each milestone in my recovery, reading from the extensive library we had built together over our years of marriage, and sharing quiet evenings on our porch where we could watch the sunset and reflect on how far we had traveled from those terrible days when we thought our love might not survive their coordinated assault. John and I became passionate advocates for elder protection, sharing our story at conferences and working with legal organizations to strengthen laws against family-perpetrated abuse. Our experience had shown us how easily the system could be manipulated by predatory relatives, and we were determined to help other vulnerable seniors avoid the trap we had barely escaped. Our home once again filled with love, laughter, and the presence of genuine friends who valued us for who we were rather than what we possessed, had truly become our sanctuary again. The peace we had fought so hard to protect was deeper and more meaningful because we understood how easily it could be lost. The trusting, somewhat naive woman I had been before my stroke was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger, more resilient, with a spirit that had been tested by fire and emerged unbreakable. I carried no bitterness toward Michael and Lisa, only a profound sense of peace and gratitude for John's enduring love and our hard-won freedom from their poisonous influence. I had learned that true family is defined by loyalty, love, and mutual respect rather than mere blood relations, and that the deepest, most meaningful bonds are forged in truth and tested by adversity rather than simply assumed through genetics. The people who truly belonged in our lives were those who celebrated our happiness rather than those who sought to destroy it for their own gain. The story of the stepmother's impossible battle teaches us that authentic family relationships are built on genuine care and protection rather than exploitation and manipulation. While the darkness of betrayal by those we love most can threaten to consume us entirely, an unwavering spirit, coupled with hidden truth and strategic preparation, can ultimately triumph over even the most sophisticated cruelty. True strength is not found in the absence of vulnerability, but in the courage to fight back when that vulnerability is exploited by those who should protect us most. Justice may be delayed, but it is never truly denied when we have the wisdom to document our experiences and the determination to seek help from those who understand the difference between genuine concern and calculated abuse. My hand, now stronger and steadier than it had been in months, rests gently in John's as we sit together on our porch watching another beautiful sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The familiar warmth of his touch, the unspoken understanding that flows between us after surviving the ultimate test of our commitment, reminds me that love truly can conquer all when it is built on a foundation of truth, trust, and unwavering devotion. What hidden strengths lie dormant within you, waiting patiently for the moment when life demands that you defy what seems impossible and fight for what matters most?